and it makes infections harder to treat. And of course, it increases the risk of disease spreading, the severity of the illness, and increases deaths as well.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. UNGA Week is here. As I speak, hundreds of world leaders are on their way to New York for the opening of the 79th United Nations General Assembly. This is always one of the most important moments in international diplomacy, and this week will be no different. For today's episode, I wanted to share with you some of the stories that I think will drive the agenda in New York this week. That includes two substantive meetings at the UN that are not likely to get the attention they deserve. One on antimicrobial resistance, the other on the impacts of sea level rise. Later in this episode, you will hear from two experts who will discuss what to expect from those meetings. For now, I wanted to offer my own take on some of the stories I will be following most closely this week. And that starts with the Summit of the Future. On Sunday and Monday, leaders are gathering for the Summit of the Future, which is the culmination of years of discussions around how to make the UN and multilateralism more broadly better responsive to future global challenges. At time of recording, there are still ongoing discussions over the Pact for the Future, the key outcome document from this summit. So the results of the Summit of the Future are a bit in the air at the moment. But later in this week, when the dust settles, I will invite back on Global Dispatches Daniel Perl of the Baha'i International Community, who has been following these discussions as closely as anyone. I'm excited to interview him later in the week to find out what happened at the Summit of the Future. This UNGA also comes at a time of major global crises, with most attention focused right now in the Middle East. Over on To Save Us From Hell, our sister podcast about the UN, I quipped to my co-host Anjali Dayal that the tone of UNGA this year will likely be set by whatever happened the day before in the Middle East. Well, we are now in the midst of an escalating series of provocations between Israel and Hezbollah, which may in fact lead to a widening regional conflict. Expect speeches from Netanyahu, Iran's Masoud Pezeshkian, and other players to draw a good deal of attention. There may even be a Security Council meeting on this crisis, though at time of recording, none has been scheduled during high-level week. A crisis that is on the Security Council agenda is Ukraine. There is a council meeting on Ukraine scheduled for Tuesday afternoon. I would expect that Biden would attend for the fact that the meeting is scheduled following Biden's farewell UNGA address earlier that morning. Don't expect any outcome from this meeting, but do expect sparks. I would imagine that Zelensky will attend, as will a Russian representative, potentially to include Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. The third crisis that I believe will be top of mind for many diplomats this week is Sudan. This is the largest humanitarian crisis by the numbers, and the UN keeps putting out warning after warning of a growing food and famine crisis. Notably, one of the generals who is leading this civil war is also titularly the head of state, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. He'll be addressing UNGA, which is wild. I expect this to be a cringeworthy speech, to say the least. This week will also be a bit of a Biden foreign policy farewell tour. The White House has not yet announced his scheduled bilateral meetings, but the president's participation at UNGA always follows a familiar pattern. He'll be the second to speak on Tuesday morning, after which he'll host a luncheon for world leaders in his capacity as president of the UN's host country. So Biden's schedule is still TBD, but expect wherever the president is and whatever the president says to really suck up a lot of the UNGA oxygen. So always during UNGA, there are some genuinely important but often overlooked meetings that don't get the attention they deserve despite their potential impact. These are substantive meetings on a particular topic held under the rubric of a so-called high-level meeting. Months and sometimes years of diplomacy tend to precede these meetings, and they often deliver some concrete outcomes. This year, there are two such meetings to highlight: a high-level meeting on antimicrobial resistance and one on the consequences of sea level rise. For today's episode, I am first joined by Dr. Ahmed Ogwell, Vice President of Global Health Strategy at the UN Foundation, who tells us what to expect from the high-level meeting on antimicrobial resistance. Then, I'm joined by Kerrlene Wills, the Director for Ocean and Climate at the UN Foundation, who discusses the summit on sea level rise. All right, I am gearing up for UNGA. Stay hydrated, everyone. And now here is Ahmed Ogwell. So just to kick off, can I have you explain the scope and scale of the problem of antimicrobial resistance as it exists in the world today?
Antimicrobial resistance, I think, good to just give a brief definition. This is a situation where the pathogens that cause disease, whether it is bacteria, it is a virus, it is a fungi, it is a parasite, whichever pathogen it is, when over time it becomes resistant to medicines that usually treat them, then we call that antimicrobial resistance. And it makes infections harder to treat. And of course, it increases the risk of disease spreading, the severity of the illness, and increases deaths as well. And antimicrobial resistance is a very big problem. In fact, I would say it is one of the top 5 public health threats globally today. Although it is silent, it is quietly spreading across the world.
What are the other 4 out of curiosity?
The big things, it will be HIV, it will be TB, it will be malaria, it will be the whole group of non-communicable diseases. Then I will put in there antimicrobial resistance.
Well, so AMR is up there.
AMR will be up there, yes, because it is cross-cutting of all those disease entities that I've mentioned.
And is AMR getting worse as time progresses?
Yes, and for 2 reasons. The biggest reason why it's getting worse is because we are not intervening in time. When these pathogens become resistant, we don't pick it out early enough to be able to correct the problem. So the resistant pathogen then spreads. The second reason why it's becoming a bigger problem is because we are becoming better at surveillance. We are measuring the problem more across the world. So the numbers are also increasing. So these 2 reasons really contribute to the numbers that we are seeing of AMR burden across the world increasing.
And is it just a consequence of the overuse of antimicrobials that's driving antimicrobial resistance, presumably both in humans and in livestock?
It's a group of factors. The most common is misuse of antimicrobial antigens, whether it is an antibiotic or an antiviral medication. When we misuse medication, then we give strength to the pathogen to become resistant. So this is the key reason, misuse of antimicrobials. At the same time, we are having today farming practices that are using antimicrobials as part of the process, whether it is raising cattle, goats, chickens, whatever. The farming methods are using antimicrobials, and those antimicrobials are then being found in the human system, not for treatment, but it was meant for raising those chickens or animals. Now, when they reach the human system and interact with our pathogens become resistant to them, not as a consequence of undertreating, mistreating, but as a consequence of those antimicrobials being found in food. So these 2 major reasons are the ones that are contributing to antimicrobial resistance increasing globally.
So you've laid out the scope of the problem. What do you expect to happen at this high-level meeting on antimicrobial resistance on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly? during High Level Week?
During the high level week, we expect that our leaders, whether it is heads of states or ministers or whichever principals are there, they are actually going to discuss and share their thoughts on how to address antimicrobial resistance. So there will be political pronouncements as an entry point. Second is they are going to adopt the 2024 political declaration on AMR. And by adopting it, it will open the door for those of us who are working in this space to use the decision elements to increase and improve the way in which we tackle antimicrobial resistance across the globe. And third is it will be a signal to those who are handling resources that AMR is not only a big problem, but it has also been prioritized by political leaders as something that we need to be acting on. And so we expect that action is going to improve at country level.
So you mentioned that advocates like you who work in this space are looking forward to specific decision elements that would enable your work more deeply. Like, what are some of those decision elements that you expect?
There's actually within the draft political declaration some numeric targets. For example, a 10% reduction in AMR mortality by 2029. So we have targets to chase. For example, for financing, we are talking of at least $100 million being contributed to AMR's trust fund. So these numeric targets are within the political declaration, and it will give us the opportunity to chase a particular outcome. Second is the political declaration has defined how the UN agencies are going to work together in addressing issues of AMR. So not just health, but it will be health, it will be environment, it will be animal health, etc. They come together so that they can be able to work towards that global action plan by 2029. And then finally, it is defined within the political declaration that there will be another high level meeting in 2029. And it means that we have between now and 2029 to make some progress, and then we come back and report to the high level meeting. So these are some of the highlights of what we see are going to be key during this high level week.
So you've articulated from very substantive outcomes from this meeting, including another meeting in 2029. So this is now the second meeting on the sidelines of High Level Week during a UN General Assembly on AMR. The first one was, I think, in 2016. I was there. I remember it. And it was the first time that AMR was on the UNGA agenda. There was a lot of momentum in civil society in particular around foregrounding this issue as a key issue in global health. But from 2016 until now, could you identify any discernible progress on AMR that was kickstarted because of that initial 2016 meeting?
Yes, there has been progress. It is not at the rate, pace, and weight that we want, but there has been progress. And one concrete outcome of the 2016 high-level meeting on AMR is the high-level meeting of 2024.
Mm-hmm.
That issue has remained as a priority at the leadership level, and it has come back for review, and then we set ourselves new targets for the years to come. So the presence of the high-level meeting this year is one clear outcome. Second is the individual UN institutions, whether it was WHO, it is UNICEF, it is the one responsible for animals, WOHA, whether it is environment, UNEP. Each and every one of these platforms have on their own also generated concrete strategies of tackling AMR within their own mandates and responsibilities. So the fact that they are now coalescing at the UN General Assembly level means that what we did in 2016 actually resulted in good progress. And finally, you will see that this year, the support generated by especially non-state actors is much bigger than it was about 8 or so years ago. It tells you that the interest has increased and the commitment, the passion for achieving good results has also improved since 2016.
Yeah, I mean, so I've covered the UN for about 20 years at this point, and it is very often the case at the UN in issues like this. One meeting begets another. But the purpose of that is because the first meeting often sets targets that ought to be reached by the second meeting. And the second meeting is really like an accountability mechanism for that first meeting. So in the quantifiable targets that you identified in terms of funding, in terms of reducing deaths from antimicrobial resistance, presumably the target for achieving those is 5 years hence, or is it sooner? Or is there a target?
There are some targets that need to be achieved out of this high-level meeting of 2024. And I'll share two of them, well, maybe three. First is that these numeric targets that have been proposed in the high-level meeting have been proposed within a timeline, and that timeline is 2029, that we need to have achieved something by that time. So it gives a very clear target for the accountability mechanism to kick in. Second, there has been proposed an independent panel on evidence for action. Now, this panel is actually going to be gathering and distilling evidence across the different sectors of what they're doing. So we have a body that is going to actually be doing that accountability mechanism. Third is the resources have been given a vehicle, the AMR Multi-Partner Trust Fund. And in that way, we have a way of catalyzing funding, we have a way of collecting the funding, and then we have a way of distributing the funding, particularly to support LMICs, the low middle income countries who need certain support in as far as implementation is concerned. So the high level meeting this year has very unique characteristics when we compare it to the one that we had in 2016. And I'm very hopeful that when this is passed and implementation begins, when we meet in 2029, the progress that will have been made will be much, much better than what we've seen so far.
Dr. Ogwell, thank you so much for your time. This was helpful. And good luck for a successful AMR high-level meeting.
Thank you. We are looking forward to that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you to Dr. Ogwell. And now here is Kerrlene Wills, Director for Ocean and Climate at the UN Foundation. Kerrlene, just to kick off, there are any number of global issues that might demand a high-level meeting during high-level week at the UN. Why sea level rise and why now?
I think this is going to be a very critical meeting to discuss because I think that in the past, if you look at the ocean SDG is probably one of the most underfunded and maybe sometimes one of the most overlooked. But sea level rise is really impacting not only small island developing states, but also bigger countries as well. So I think there has been a large push to have a discussion on this issue. And if you look at the science from the IPCC, it says that global mean sea level is rising at rates unprecedented in at least the last 3,000 years. So, I mean, that might seem like a large trajectory, but I think that because we have not been maybe taking it seriously or discussing what the impacts are in a louder forum, in a bigger forum, talking about it right now has become a very critical issue. And it's a very critical moment where we're 6 years away from 2030.
Yeah.
We have trajectories to meet by 2040 and 2050 if we really want to combat climate change, and looking to the ocean and mitigating the impacts of emissions on the ocean, which lead to sea level rise, is going to be important if we want to really hit those targets.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about like the existential threat of climate change, but it's like existential in the here and now for many small island developing states and other low-lying countries. I was just talking to someone who was working on a project involving the relocation of entire communities in Fiji, inland. And you see these challenges happening all over the world. In terms of this meeting itself, like what kind of participation are we expecting? And is it one of those things where it is something that these small island states were pushing for? Because around the UN, these countries often do carry like a heavy moral weight for the fact that they are so directly imperiled by climate change.
Yeah, and I expect a lot of high-level participation from countries in the Alliance of Small Island States, so that's AOSIS. I do expect high level representation from also bigger countries. Hopefully the US, it would be great to see them there.
Is there a question of whether they might spend a representative there or not?
I'm not sure, but I know that
Mhm.
it can be sometimes a little bit difficult for the youth to decide which area to engage in,
Mm.
especially in a election year. But I know that there has been a big push, at least within the context of politics in the US, to support initiatives that are important to the Caribbean. So, of course, like high sea level rise is important, initiatives that are important to SIDS and LDCs. I don't want to say because I don't want to anticipate, but I do
Mhm.
hope to see representation there. And I know in the lead up, a lot of these issues have become at the forefront of US ocean policy because of the impact on SIDS.
And you're saying SIDS, that's small island developing states. And you also
Yes,
mentioned LCD, the least developed countries.
yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, like, many countries, if not most in the world, do have a coastline. So presumably there would be some interest in this. But it does seem, at least from what you're saying and from what I'm understood, that this really is driven by island states.
Yeah, I think the whole issue came about because small island states were saying to the UN, hey, this issue is important. Small island states like Maldives, Tuvalu, a lot of impact from the voices in the Pacific that were saying, like, this issue is important to us. We need to have it discussed at a high level. So I think that's how this issue came about. So I do expect that for SIDS that are immediately impacted and the most vulnerable, you will see them present and participating at
Mhm.
this meeting.
So what are you looking towards during the meeting itself?
I expect that there will be high level discussions on, the science behind why this meeting is happening, the information from the IPCC, looking at projections on the latest data on sea level rise, including updated projections and how fast and far sea levels are expected to rise. I'm also expecting a focus on the vulnerable countries. So that is, like I said, the small island states and low-lying coastal nations. I think that's an opportunity for them to really present their experiences, what's been happening, and have that being discussed at the UN. I think one of the biggest discussions that will come up is financing commitments for climate and adaptation, financing commitments to prevent against sea level rise. So looking at what can the Green Climate Fund do or the Adaptation Fund, both of which support countries in building coastal defenses, relocating populations, improving resilience on rising seas. There might even be a conversation on loss and damage, which I know is a very highly political discussion, but very important in the context of broader issues for small island developing states. This has been pushed by Mia Motley and the Bridgetown Initiative. So I do expect that this might become one of the highlights of what
Hmm.
is discussed at this meeting.
So what sort of outcomes are you expecting from this meeting?
Traditionally in the UN, there will be an outcome document that highlights what the meeting has discussed and what are the intentions and the next steps to move forward. So I do expect that there will be such a document that highlights those things on what's discussed. Of course, those things in the context of these discussions might be a little bit political. So the language, I'm not too sure yet on how that will pan out, but hoping for some strong language that will put climate financing towards
Hmm.
mitigating sea level rise. Some of the things that I mentioned in terms of the climate financing aspects that will be important, hoping to see something like that in the
Hmm.
document.
Well, to that end, I mean, having covered the UN for so long, it's often times that meetings like this are framed in such a way as building momentum towards like the next meeting. Is this like a momentum builder towards anything coming up?
I definitely think it is a momentum builder. We have, of course, COP29 that's happening in Baku in
Hmm.
November. So it is definitely a build-up to have further discussions there. There's also the UN Ocean Conference that will take place from June 9th to the 13th in Nice, France, that is co hosted by France and the government of Costa Rica. And will look at issues related to supporting the implementation of SDG 14, which is the conservation and sustainable use of ocean resources. So there's an opportunity to continue the conversation from UNGA there as well. But then you have a big COP happening in Brazil, COP 30, where a lot of the climate issues will be at
Mm.
the forefront for them. So I think this is just one of the big high level steps in the next step for the discussions on what's happening in sea level rise. Because like I mentioned, we're not too far away from 2030. We have expected to, reduce emissions by 2050. And so we have to have these discussions, but these discussions also have to include action items at the end of the day. So this is just the start of the momentum, I think.
Kerrlene, thank you so much for your analysis and framing this high-level meeting for us.
Happy to be a part of the discussion.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.